It's okay. It's okay. We're early.
Our next speaker is Moayad Skaif. He is a journalist who helped organize a network of reporters at the beginning of the Syrian uprisings to counter the propaganda of pro-Assad outlets. She coordinated the Freedom Convoy for Syria to bring journalists into the country, and his activism has put himself and his family or made them a target of the Assad regime. He's also been threatened by Islamists for his campaigns against child marriages. So please welcome him.
مساء الخير. I will speak in Arabic.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be speaking in Arabic. I hope you will understand me. I am an ordinary citizen. My name is Moayed Iskiaf. I'm an ordinary citizen like other ordinary citizens, and I would like to protest against the ill treatment by Assad since the beginning of the revolution. Perhaps you may not know what is really happening, or perhaps the image is rather blurry. So allow me to explain this to you as a Syrian citizen and as a journalist. I would like to draw the general lines of what is happening. In April of 2011, a certain number of families demonstrated against Bashar al-Assad because he had imprisoned their children. Their children had written on the walls of the school. They had put a certain number of expressions, as was done in Egypt and in Tunisia during the Arab Spring, but President Assad imprisoned them, ripped off their nails, tortured them. So the parents protested. They asked for their children to be returned, but the regime killed them. They took action against the families, which closed ranks, and they were told they were terrorists and Salafists. This is the action that the regime carried out to put down a revolution, to put down any revolutionary activity against the regime. And this is not just due to politics. This is because people said, we are against the murders. We're against the slaughter being carried out by the Assad regime. This is probably an exception today. In the region near Damas, there's a young man whose name is Rias Matar. And he launched an initiative to offer flowers and water to Assad's soldiers because he was against war. And so the soldiers put him in prison, tortured him, and killed him, and delivered his body to his family with a letter saying, you can turn him into minced meat. And they signed a document saying that terrorist Islamists who were armed had killed this young man. This is an example of what the Bashar al-Assad regime has done. Perhaps there are videos, we'll see demonstrations, we'll see photos, and many other people will tell us what is happening. And we will learn about what the regime has done. They have committed torture in prisons. And they have used all types of weaponry, things that are unimaginable. I was in Aleppo. I saw how the regime of Assad launched Scud missiles against inhabited areas. I saw the destruction due to the bullet shots. They did how chemical weapons were used, and in the suburbs of Damas, blinded tanks were used, and all kinds of other weaponry, and a new weapon, that is, to encircle the region, to starve the population. These are just a few examples of what the Assad regime has done. Now, since the beginning of the revolution, my family was against the slaughter, the carnage, the injustices. All we wanted was a free and democratic country. We yearned for a free country, like many other countries in the world where there isn't a bloody regime, a corrupt regime. I think this is a natural dream that all people and all countries have. Since the beginning of the revolution, and my uncles, I have 7, in fact, have been imprisoned. Other people have been imprisoned as well at their workplace of work. One uncle is 85 years old. Another uncle who is 63 years old. His son, 33 years old, were all dragged into prison. They were grabbed at their workplace. And we know that there are many who have been tortured and murdered. We have photos of people who were tortured and killed. We learned about this from information. My uncle, Moayed Iskiaf, was killed. They're peaceful activists, and he was killed in an abject, infamous manner. He was inquiring with my uncle, aged 85, about what was happening, and my 63-year-old uncle was present. And the regime started to humiliate him and to attack him. My young uncle revolted. And so the soldiers threw themselves on him, started to beat him, and 2 days later, he died of his wounds. My uncle Bassel, I'd like to add, was a poet, a singer. He sang at all the family parties. He had a beautiful voice. Less than a year ago, the security forces, about 100 soldiers, went into his home while he was asleep with his wife and his children, and they stole everything. They took everything he had in his home, and they demolished everything they couldn't carry with them, and they beat him in front of his wife and children. During one of my trips, during my vacation in Syria, I had brought a present from my brother. The Assad soldiers took the gifts. We should not justify terrorist practices. If we justify them, then we ourselves are committing terrorist acts. Assad claims that he is fighting terrorism. He claims that he is fighting terrorism. Is that true? Is that what is happening? Is he doing that with Scuds? Does he need to bomb civilian neighborhoods? These are actions that no one in the 21st century could possibly imagine. But this is what is happening in Syria today. So personally, I think about it, and I try and understand how I, as a journalist, can transmit this information. How can I recount what is happening within the country? And sometimes I say, I can't do this, because it is not something that you can recount with words or with films. I went to a region that had people who were fleeing, and I asked them why they were running away. There were missiles being launched there. So the population got together to save the people who had been trapped under the rubble. And that is when the regime started launching rockets against those people who were trying to provide assistance to those who were trapped. We've heard that things are calming down, and then a half hour later, once again, the rockets start raining down on the same area. The goal is not only to kill people, the goal was to prevent the journalists from being able to go there and take photographs. They strike hard. They try to strike this region very hard, like all the other regions that are trying to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. The government is trying to punish those who revolt against it. You'll see the picture later on of a young man whom I interviewed. His entire family was killed beside his father and a large number of his neighbors. And this young boy was talking to me in the form of a poem. And I think it would be impossible to convey all of that. He said, after the bombing, my father called and said, "Are you okay?" I was afraid for my father, and I was bleeding. And I said, "Yes, I'm fine." "But are you all right?" This was a child. He was 10 years old. And at this terrible moment was worried about how his father was doing. Imagine Naif, this young boy, and who at the end of this interview asked me this question: why is Bashar al-Assad trying to kill us? Is it the law of the jungle? And I think that it's hard to find an answer to this question. It would be hard for humanity, the history of humanity, to find an answer, to understand why this crime is being committed. This recalls the Holocaust. This recalls the slaughter of millions of innocents, or Rwanda. Are we seeing it again? Should we stand by and not react? Well, this slaughtering is taking place in Syria. There are numbers of people being tortured, and can we say we didn't know, I didn't realize? Can we do this? I'm asking you. Thank you.
I don't know if this, yes, it's on. Okay, so we just have a couple of minutes for discussion now. And I want to ask Mr. An, you mentioned the UN inquiry that outlined different human rights abuses in North Korea. I was wondering what you think the international community can do to follow up on what was found in that report. Sure. You had mentioned the UN inquiry into the human rights abuses in North Korea, and I was wondering what you think the international community can do now to follow up and address some of the issues that were mentioned in the report. We just have to wait for a translator.
Can you speak the question again?
Sure. I was wondering what steps could the international community take to follow up on some of the issues that were addressed in the UN report on North Korea?
UN 리포트가 어쨌든 관계에 위해서 어떤 관계? 요약을 해줬는지.
그 UN COI 이 보고서가 저를 포함한 탈북자들과 즉 북한 전문가들 사이에서는 굉장한 훌륭한 교과서와 같은 곳이라고 지금 생각을 합니다. 최근에 나온 북한 관련 보고서에 관련돼서 정말로 북한을 제대로 파악을 했고 그에 대한 대체 방안까지 당겨졌다고 생각을 합니다. 그래서 그 COI 보고서가 실천적으로 국제사회에서 이제 실현이 될 수 있도록 여러 유엔과 관련된 각국과 그리고 여러 NGO들이 힘을 합쳐서 보고서의 내용이 담긴 대로 실현 가능할 수 있도록 해주시면 고맙겠습니다.
Thank you. My next question is for Ms. Portieles, and I wanted to ask you if you could expand a little bit on, well, actually, we need a translation. My next question will be for Mr. Iskiaf. And you mentioned that you had started out at the beginning, before the revolution, of you were pro-democracy, your family supported democracy, and I'm wondering, do you think that there is a chance now for democracy in Syria after everything that we have seen happen?
أريد طبعا أن أتحدث بالعربية لا أعرف الترجمة تسمعون كي لا نقع.
Can you hear me? I'm going to speak in Arabic. You can hear me. Okay. It's true that the dream of democracy in Syria today, in particular, is a virtual and unrealistic dream for the time being. We cannot talk about a real war. There is growing violence. Increasingly, there are terrorist activities, Islamist activists, increasingly, who enter Syria and threaten democracy. I'd like to mention something personal. One of the accusations against my family and myself are that we are accused of being Democrats. That is the accusation that has been launched by the regime. The same that is launched against all the opponents. And that launched by extreme countries, the ISIS, the Islamic states of Iraq and the Levant. They've attacked my family, accusing us of being Democrats, pro-democracy. We want democracy, they say. That shows how serious things are concerning the future of Syria. I'm a dreamer, it is true. But we are now in our 4th year of the revolution. Despite being able to use all means possible to weaken the resolution of the Syrians, they're still there, they're still fighting, they're fighting for dignity. The people are trying to find out to gain power and to introduce democracy. For we want a realistic, real future. But we must rid ourselves of the hurdles, overcome obstacles that have been placed before us. And that makes things more difficult. And what makes things even more difficult are the small groups of terrorists. And I think that Bashar al-Assad should try to take advantage of that. I think that he is continuing to take advantage of this, but we ourselves should get rid of these extremist groups. As I said before, I'm thinking of ISIS. We need the support of the international community. We need the aid, the assistance of the United Nations. I am sorry for having taken the floor so long. I've tried to summarize what has been happening in Syria. Thank you.
So I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on Cuba's position on the Human Rights Council, and what kind of influence do you think that Cuba will have on the Council?
I think that Cuba should not be included. Cuba should not have a seat on the Human Rights Council because they violate human rights. And we see this in the repression that is being carried out. The prisoners that are so ill-treated. The conditions are terrible. They're considered to be rats. They're beaten continuously. And human rights defenders have no voice. There's no freedom of expression. There's no freedom of thought. We have prisoners of conscience like Fernando de Benza who have been imprisoned because they have different viewpoints from that of the Castro regime. People are aggrieved. They're fed up. We shouldn't even think that Cuba should be part of the Council of Human Rights because it's one of the main violators of human rights in the world. One of the countries that ill-treats human rights advocates on a daily basis.
And thanks to UN Watch for hosting this event.